Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, After the Disaster, Food Safety and Dealing with Mold in Your Childcare Setting. My name is Holly Nett and I'm the Community Resilience Manager on the Emergency Preparedness Team at Child Care Aware of America. Thank you for your interest in today's webinar. We had over 500 individuals register. 2017 was a historical year of natural disasters. Many childcare programs experienced tremendous water damage due to hurricanes, and extended power outages were common with the variety of disasters that occurred across the country. We're excited to have the expertise of staff from the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service and the North Carolina Department of Public Health in this session. It's been a pleasure to work with them in preparing for the webinar for all of you. The Emergency Preparedness Team at Child Care Aware of America has a large number of tools and resources related to preparedness, response, and recovery on our webpage, www.childcareprepare.org. We invite you to visit the site to sign up for the Child Care Emergency Preparedness Listserv to receive updates and notifications on new resources that become available for the childcare industry. Today's webinar is part of a spring and summer webinar series focused on childcare disaster preparation, response, and recovery topics. Next month, we'll be hosting a special webinar titled Keeping Kids Safe, the Basics of Active Shooter Response. It's a tough topic for all of us to think about, but it's an important one for all of us to consider some of the preparation steps that we can take to prevent human violence in our childcare settings. Registration links for our webinars can be found at childcareprepare.org. You can also find several archived webinars from last fall on this website. So let's talk about the webinar tonight. We are recording the webinar and we'll post it on our website within 1 week. Certificates of attendance will be issued by NAFCC and they'll be emailed to you within 2 weeks to those of you who are participating in the live webinar. Certificates will be sent to the email address that you registered with. We will not be able to issue certificates for those who are accessing the archived recording only. All participant lines are muted, but you can type a comment or question into the question box. We'll allow time at the completion of the presentation for a question and answer period. If we can't get to all of the questions, we'll try to follow up with an email response to you. I want to show you a few tips related to the webinar screen. On the right side of the screen, you should see a navigation panel. And you can expand or collapse this panel by clicking on the orange arrow near the top. You will also see that we've included 2 handouts for this session, and that's indicated by a blue circled area. The yellow arrow is pointing to an area which you can type a question. So when we get to the point where you want to ask the presenters some questions, you can click on that little area to expand it and type your question in there. So let's meet tonight's presenters. From the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service, we have 2 presenters. Susan Isberg joined the Food Safety and Inspection Service in 2006. The USDA is the public health agency within the United States Department of Ag that looks at food safety and inspection, keeping all of our food safe. She currently conducts surveillance and investigation of meat, poultry, processed egg, and fish facilities. She also investigates foodborne illness outbreaks and responds to natural disaster and intentional contamination events. Susan's a native of Boston. She graduated from Northeastern University, and she holds degrees in English and food science. We also have Aubrey Williams, and she's an Enforcement Investigations and Analysis Officer with the Food Safety and Inspection Service. She is a graduate of Iowa State University, where her primary focus was on microbiology, and she attended graduate school at Des Moines University with a focus on public health. Aubrey is passionate about sharing her knowledge of food safety and looks forward to speaking with you today. Welcome, ladies. We're also pleased to have with us David Lipton. David is an industrial hygiene consultant with the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology Branch at the Division of Public Health within the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. David has 8 years of experience with North Carolina's OSHA, 23 years with public health, and he's been involved with response and recovery after 5 major hurricanes and floods. David is a subject matter expert to the North Carolina Division of Public Health. He focuses primarily on flooding, dampness, and mold growth. Welcome, David. We look forward to hearing from you soon. So let's get started, and I would like to turn it over to Susan from the USDA Food Safety and Investigation.
Hi, I would like to thank you for inviting us on. I think this is such a good topic, especially with all the power outages and storms, and we're coming into an especially tough type of the year. So thanks for having us on. And this first slide just shows a little bit of what we do with our part of the USDA. We're one team, we're one purpose, which is to protect the public and prevent foodborne illness. And we have a number of different people in jobs that work with us in the USDA. We have veterinarians, we have frontline supervisors, we have our in-plant inspectors, we have investigators, we have EIOs, and they all work together to ensure that the food that you serve to your families as well as the children is safe, wholesome, and unadulterated. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about food safety during severe weather and, try to give you some tips on how to keep food safe before, during, and after the emergencies cause the power outages. And if you follow these tips, it'll help minimize the food loss and reduce your risk of foodborne illness. Next slide, please. And if you have some advance notice that a storm is coming, up here in the Northeast, we kind of know when the blizzards are coming. I know that the tornadoes, et cetera, will be a little bit more difficult. But with the, if you hear that a hurricane's coming, there's some things you can do before the storm actually comes that would put you in a better position to keep your food safe. If you can plan ahead, we can't stress that enough, how important that would be. If you have appliance thermometers, I would put them in your refrigerator and your freezer. You want to keep your freezer at 0 degrees or below. And when you're putting your food together in the freezer, if you group them together, they're going to stay colder longer. The air's not going to be able to circulate, and it'll keep them frozen, for a longer period of time. For your refrigerator, you want to keep that 40 degrees or below. And if you know that a storm is coming, if you take containers of water or gel packs and freeze them, that would also help keep the food cold if the power goes out. If you have leftovers or milk or fresh meat and poultry that you're not going to use immediately, if you freeze those, it'll also, the colder it is, the better it will be when the power goes out. If you think that the power is going to be out for an extended period of time, if you can get some dry or block ice to keep the fridge or the freezer cold. And if you have non-perishable foods, if you put them on the higher shelves to avoid the flood waters. If you have access to cinder blocks, it's also if you could put your refrigerator and freezers on the cinder blocks before possible flooding. So if you do hear that you are expecting a storm, like if someone said, okay, there's a storm coming, I don't know if I'd know where I could run down and buy dry ice or block ice. So if you know where in your area you could, that would be, useful. And our FoodKeeper app, which Aubrey's going to talk about in a little while, also has information on what foods do and what foods do not freeze well. Next slide. I'm going to talk about the danger zone. The danger zone is the temperature range between 40 and 140 degrees where most bacteria grow most rapidly, doubling in number in a little bit as 20 minutes. That temperature range before 40 and 140 is that's what the microbes like to grow. And it's not just once they'll double. If something's in that temperature range, it will, they will continue to grow, and which will make the food unsafe to eat. During a power outage, it's easy for the perishable foods to enter that zone. And when the foods, like if those foods are left at this range, it causes the bacteria such as Staph aureus, Salmonella enteritidis, E. coli, and Campylobacter to grow to dangerous levels that can cause illness. And those four pathogens are ones that we commonly see when we do foodborne illness outbreaks, and they do make people sick. The food should be disposed if they're held in the danger zone for over 2 hours, which again is 40 to 140 degrees, or within 1 hour if the temperature is above 90 degrees. Next slide, please. And when the power is out, so you lose your power, the storm comes, you lose your power, you have your freezer is nicely packed, you have your gel packs in there. The one thing you don't want to do is open and close the doors either to the freezer or the refrigerator. If you keep those doors closed, it will keep the air in there, and it's less apt to spoil your food. If you have a closed door, a full freezer will hold its temperature for 48 hours. So if you have it all jam-packed, you took everything out of your refrigerator that you could, you put it in the freezer to freeze, and if it's nice and full, it's going to stay, will hold its temperature for 48 hours. If it's half full, it will hold it for 24 hours. The refrigerator will keep the food safe for 4 hours. But if if you're going in and out of there, obviously the cold air is going to escape, and the food is less apt to keep, its temperature. You can also add ice to the refrigerator and the freezer if the temperature begins to rise. So say you go in, you need, you want a drink, you want something out of there. If you notice that the temperature is rising, and you'll know because you have your thermometers in there, you can take some of the, the frozen ice or the ice packs if it begins to rise. Next slide, please. So once the power is back on, so the power comes back on, you go you look into your refrigerator, you look into your freezer, and you're like, okay, how did I weather this storm? When in doubt, throw it out. One of the most common questions that we get is, how my freezer went down, my refrigerator went down, how long can I hold it for? To explain, the time frames. Well, what if I taste it to see if it tastes all right? Never ever taste something to see if it tastes safe, because you can't see the pathogens, you can't see the microbes, and you won't be able to, and you could possibly get sick. What can you keep? On that little slide that you're seeing, the following foods are safe if held above 40 for more than 2 hours. So you have hard cheeses, you have grated Parmesan, butter, open fruit juices, open canned fruits, jelly, relish, taco, mustard, Worcestershire sauce, peanut butter, vinegar. If you're looking at the things that I'm listing, you can tell that they're really not, it's not the type of stuff that you think is going to get bad, because it's not, a hard cheese is much less likely to get temperature abused than if you have a soft cheese or a shredded cheese. So what should you throw out? Meat, poultry, or seafood products, soft cheeses, shredded cheeses, milk, cream, yogurt, other dairy products. You have any open baby formula or anything, baby foods, things like that, throw them out. The eggs and the egg products, which would include the liquid eggs, those would also, if if you're in doubt, throw them out. Cooked pasta, dough, and if you have cooked or cut produce, that would be thrown out. But if the produce is uncooked and it's raw and not cut, then that would, that you would be able to use that. So if the fridge and the freezer are at safe temperatures, so remember you want to have 40 or below for the refrigerator and 0 for the freezer, your food should be fine. And so if you have those appliance thermometers, they're not really expensive, and they do save a lot of time and worry, as well as money, if you have that in there, because you'll know, okay, my temperature is 30, it's 39 degrees, my stuff is going to be okay. Oh, my temperature, my thermometers are saying 52. I'm not going to want to be keeping that. You want to discard opened mayonnaise, tartar sauce, or horseradish if they're above 50 for over 8 hours. If anything's contaminated by juices that were dripping from the raw meat, poultry, or fish, you want to get rid of that. And then you can look for clues to tell you whether or not your food is safe. Are the ice cubes melted? Have frozen food packages changed shapes? Do the frozen foods have snow or crystals? And you can actually refreeze the food that still contains ice crystals or is at 40 degrees or below. And some foods that are commonly stored in the refrigerator but are safe above 40 are, as we said, the hard cheese, etc. You might want to look at, if you have open jellies or things like that have high acid, ketchup, relishes, they'll spoil sooner if they're not held under refrigeration. So if they have an unusual odor or if they turn moldy, you don't want to eat them. And the one thing that I can't stress enough is never taste the food to determine its safety. You're not going to be able to tell. It won't necessarily taste bad, but if it has been in the danger zone for enough time, those microbes have been multiplying, and you could get a nasty bout of foodborne illness. Next slide, please. I think this is there. Turn it over to Audrey.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So now we're going to talk about removing odors. So after a power outage, we keep stuff in the refrigerator for an extended period of time and spoils. It gets to be a horrendous odor. So here's some ideas, some suggestions on how to get rid of odors. So if your refrigerator or freezer are without power, again, for an extended period of time, those odors may develop from those spoiled foods. So dispose of the spoiled food and wash all surfaces, including the gaskets in the door. Do your solution with the bleach and water, and also following up with a baking soda rinse. So those directions are there on the slide. These steps may need to be repeated to completely remove the odors. Next slide, please. So if the odor remains after you attempt to remove the odors with the steps on the previous slide, here are some additional cleaning steps that you can take to help remove the odors. This includes some use of vinegar and water solutions, newspaper, keeping some newspaper in there, fresh ground coffee grounds, and vanilla extract, and airing the refrigerator out for an extended period of time. Next slide, please. So if flooding has also occurred, use the steps identified in the slide here after floods to dispose of potentially unsafe food or cooking utensils. So never eat anything that's been involved in a flood. Discard your food. Discard anything that has cardboard or is not water tight. Any damaged cans or anything that looks abnormal when you're looking at cans, those should all be disposed of. And again, 1 tablespoon bleach to 1 gallon water sanitizer can be used to clean up after flooding occurs. Next slide, please. So food exposed to fires can be damaged by the heat of the fire. Smoke fumes, firefighting chemicals. These fumes and chemicals cannot be washed off food. So while cans and jars may appear to be okay, the heat from the fire can damage the containers and can activate food spoilage bacteria. So we wouldn't recommend keeping any of those items. Again, this is after a fire. So dispose of your foods after fires. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Some more information specifics when it comes to dealing with food safety emergencies due to disasters. You can contact the meat and poultry hotline, and there are multiple ways to contact us. One is through Ask Karen, available at askkaren.gov. There's food safety experts available Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time on the meat and poultry hotline, and that's 1-888-674-6854. That information is included here on the slide. You can also access the food safety answers anytime from your mobile device at m.askkaren.gov. For more times and notifications, you may also follow us on Twitter at USDA Food Safety or on Facebook. These services are available both in English and Spanish. And so any time you have a food-related question, you can contact this number, whether it's in a disaster situation or just an everyday question. And we'd be more than happy to help you there. Next slide, please. So for more information, help on storage guidelines, we have the FoodKeeper App, which has more than 600 different food and beverage items downloaded on it. The FoodKeeper also offers cooking advice for meat, poultry, seafood, and egg products to help users prepare these foods safely. Another great thing about the app is that it allows you to enter the date something was purchased. So, for example, you buy some ground beef today, and you type that into the FoodKeeper, and in 2 days, the app will send you a notification letting you know that you should either cook it, freeze it, or it may not be safe to eat anymore. If you don't have a smartphone, but do have access to a computer, the application can be accessed on the foodsafety.gov website as well. Next slide, please. The USDA also has many free food safety publications available for order. The best way to order is by calling the meat and poultry hotline. We do have limited quantities of educational promotional items such as keychains and others, but those are also available, and again, in limited quantities. But we have multiple brochures that you can contact us, and we'd be more than happy to send to you. Next slide, please. So you can also visit our website at foodsafety.gov or follow us again on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. So that will conclude our presentation today. We thank you for your time and the invitation to participate in this webinar.
Thanks, Aubrey, and thanks, Susan. One thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is over in the handout section of the webinar slide, you'll see that there is a handout posted, and it's titled Keep Your Food Safe During Emergencies. So that's a great pamphlet that they've put together at USDA that really reiterates a lot of the information that was provided in this webinar today. So feel free to download that. We'll also have that posted on our website next to the recording within a week of this session. So feel free to check that out. But I appreciate your help, Susan and Aubrey, and great information. Power outages happen so frequently that I think these questions come up often, especially when we have well-stocked refrigerators and freezers because of the work that we do in the childcare industry. So certainly appreciate your time. And just a reminder to all of you, if you have questions for either Aubrey or Susan, go ahead and type those into the question area. And at the end of this webinar, we will certainly get to some of those questions. So with that, I will turn it over to our next presenter, David Lipton, and he's with us, like we said before, from the North Carolina Department of Public Health. So welcome, David.
Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm going to be talking about responding to flood damage and mold growth in child care programs. So next slide, please. Holly's already kind of given you a brief overview of my resume. I'll say that my house has never been flooded, but I've been without power 2 or 3 times for more than a week in the aftermath of hurricanes. So I've been to many disasters. So anyway, next slide, please. Before I get to the main meat of my presentation, you can have devastating mold growth in buildings from clean water leaks, and I deal with those most frequently. In the top picture, that's actually condensation under vinyl wallpaper, and in the picture on the right, that's an air conditioning condensate drain that overflowed, and it can almost be as bad as flood damage. But the challenge with flooding is that the water is grossly unsanitary, and it's almost impossible to predict what might be in that water. And when that water recedes, there's going to be stuff left behind. So that's what amps up the challenges of dealing with flood water compared to those other kinds of problems, although they can be disastrous. Next slide, please. So one of the premises is that children are more sensitive than adults to these kind of situations. And so their immune systems aren't developed. They're closer to the sources. Infants and tend to crawl on the floor. And there's also different exposure pathways. Infants and toddlers and even preschoolers, they tend to touch things and transfer stuff hand to mouth. That's a huge exposure pathway that's less of a concern in adults, but it's a big issue for kids. The other issue is that they have a higher respiratory rate than adults, and so they will take up more stuff than we will, and that can be a problem too. I think that child care facilities are an important part of our community infrastructure, and they really provide business and social and public health services. I think they're a little bit underestimated, and so part of your planning really needs to be making sure that your emergency plans are kind of in line with your local emergency planning issues, and they know you're out there. And also another big part of that is making sure that your plans and what you're going to do is in line with your licensing agency and public health entity. The whole goal of this is that you want to be able to open your child care facility as quickly as possible. That means you'll have to go through the licensing and environmental health inspections. So I also think that keeping records is really important. Whether it's for taxes or permitting or licensing or making sure that contractors did what they said they're going to do, or recovery efforts, keeping records is also really important. Next slide, please. This is kind of an overview of what happens in a disaster, and each bar kind of represents the length of time. I'm going to be focusing on the interim recovery, which is the things that you're going to do to stabilize and maintain your building and your facility. So the whole idea is you don't want things to get worse. And so you're going to get rid of gross contaminants. You're going to start drying stuff. That's going to keep things from getting worse. And the general strategy that you're going to follow, and this pretty much comes from FEMA and from the CDC, is going to be to air out, move out, tear out, clean out, and then I added keep records. But that's going to be the general strategy that you have. So next slide, please. So as you're thinking about this too, the temptation is going to be to jump right into this. Well, it's probably better to think a little bit ahead, because you're going to want to create some order in a very chaotic situation. So again, you're going to be thinking about who's doing the work, how you're going to do it. This waste disposal, or the issues of things that you can keep or save, where are you going to put them so they won't get further damage? That's a really big issue. And also in the world of emergency response, this issue of waste disposal is becoming an area that's of big emphasis. And there's going to be, it needs to be segregated, and there's going to be everything from rotted or spoiled food to vegetation to construction demolition debris, maybe even household hazardous waste. And so those things if you segregate them, it's easier for everybody to dispose of them. So you'll need to be thinking about both those things some too. Next slide, please. So for the air outs, that's going to be the first thing you can do when you can get back into the building safely. And this is also the time where there's the greatest risk for physical hazards, whether it's structural damage, maybe live wires you didn't know about, gas leaks, hazardous waste, animals. So that's really a time that is going to be potentially risky, but it's a crucial thing to start getting the airflow in and getting airflow going everywhere in the structure when you can. There is one disadvantage, that if your building has been flooded by what you know to be raw sewage, that in some cases mechanical ventilation can actually spread airborne contaminants around, but generally getting air moving is really the important part. So next slide, please. So the next thing is that you want to move out, and you've got two things that you're going to be doing. You're going to be trying to you're going to be trying to move stuff that hadn't been damaged to a place where it can be kept clean and dry. That's keeping your stuff. But the other part is that you're going to be starting to get rid of all of the materials that got flooded or that are saturated or they're damp or have visible mold growth on them. And that's going to be getting rid of moisture sources, and it's also going to be preventing mold spores from being generated and spread around to the other parts. So you've got those two angles, the stuff you want to keep and the stuff that you know has to be disposed. Next slide, please. So the tear out is going to be basically you're going to get everything down to hard, non-porous materials, or as close to it as you can. And the idea is that you're going to remove moisture reservoirs, and you're also going to promote drying. So that means getting up wall-to-wall carpeting, including the tack strips, and of course there's a laceration hazard there. You're going to need to be pulling cabinets. You may decide that you can keep them or not keep them at some point in time later. You're going to remove tile flooring, vinyl floors, laminate floors. You're going to remove plaster and drywall. So generally, after many, many floods, the guidance is that if the water level was less than 2.5 feet, you cut drywall at 4 feet. And that's because drywall comes in 4x8 and 4x12 panels. It makes it easier to install the new drywall. If the water level was greater than 2.5 feet, you go up to 8 feet, or the ceiling, whichever's higher. The issue is that water can move rapidly up drywall by wicking. It can move support mold growth 18 or 20 inches or more above the high water mark, and you want to get rid of that stuff. It's a paper layer on the inside. You want to get rid of electrical outlets and switch plates and baseboards and window moldings. And at this point also, this is where knowledge about your structure is really important. For example, hopefully you know if there's asbestos-containing materials in your structure. And if you do, that's a really good thing, because we've had situations where contractors have stopped work when they saw tile flooring until the owner could prove that there was no asbestos in the floor tiles, and that delays your work, and you want to be moving along things as fast as you can. So that may be a regulatory requirement depending on your setting too. Clean out, please. Next slide. So cleaning actually, there's a science of cleaning. It's an environmental management activity where you identify and extract and collect and remove contaminants. And so one big thing about cleaning is that you might have to do it multiple times. You might do mucking out. You might do more detailed cleaning. And then when you're doing more detailed cleaning, it's really important that you don't contaminate your washing solutions or your rinsing solutions. So sometimes people will use what's called either the 3-bucket method or the wet wipe and toss method. which actually has been modified, and it's the kind of final cleaning that's used for the lead renovation, repair, and painting rule. There's pretty good descriptions in that guidance document. Things that are saved also need to be cleaned. And this also may be a time where you want to use disinfectants or sanitizing solutions, especially if you've had a sewage backflow and you think there might be viral or bacterial contamination. Bleach is the most common one and the one that most people have around. It is an excellent sanitizer for hard, non-porous items, metal, plastic and glass, and formica and things like that. Unfortunately, it can be corrosive to electrical components and metal. It's not very effective when there's a heavy organic loading, so it doesn't work on dirty surfaces. And it's not a substitute for cleaning. There are other cleaners and sanitizers and disinfectants that are specifically available that can be used to get rid of mold off of surfaces. What I would suggest is that all of these products are regulated as antimicrobial pesticides by the Environmental Protection Agency. Anything that is intended to destroy or inactivate microorganisms on inanimate surfaces. So that means read the label. They work best on clean surfaces, and follow the label instructions. That way they'll be the most effective and the least hazardous to the environment. If it gets down to the point of some restricted use pesticides like fumigants and stuff, that might need to be done by a licensed pest control professional. So now you've cleaned out and dried out. So move on to the next slide, please. Now it's dry out. And this is going to be the one, the thing at the bottom, use patience and caution. That actually turns out to be the biggest thing that we see people don't follow. When we've had hurricanes in the fall, inevitably people rip out all the stuff. They don't let things dry back to normal. And then they call us up and around this time the following year because they had left damp materials inside their buildings and their house stinks or something like that. So it takes a long time. Materials will come to equilibrium with the environment. If you're going to do rapid structural drying, I think that you really need to have it done by professionals, water damage technicians. They have the equipment and supplies and the protocols, and it's amazing that they know how to do things like dry hardwood floors so that they don't buckle or warp or anything like that. So you may need to get somebody like that if it's rapid drying. It's possible to measure solid wood with moisture meters. Probably best to have a professional do that. Generally, less than 15% moisture content is okay. More than 20, you run the risk of other materials getting damp or wet, or you run the risk of wood decaying organisms. Dry wood, plaster, plywood, they're tricky to measure, and so you can use a pad-type moisture meter like on the bottom picture. And what you do is you measure a place you think is wet and you compare it to a place that you know is dry. And that takes a little more skill, and there can be interferences. Again, it's probably best for a professional. Concrete can actually be measured, moisture in concrete, and some actually carpet and flooring contractors who are installing things on concrete will do quantitative or qualitative tests because they don't want to install their product on top of a damp concrete slab. But again, the important part is that it takes a lot longer than you think to let things dry, depending on the outdoor environment, the materials, dehumidifiers, air movement, all sorts of different things. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The record keeping. Now, this is not actually. I found this slide from a group called VOAD. The acronym stands for Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster. And I think that, primarily it was for homeowners, but flood insurance claims. But I think that it goes to the point that the more important, that you got to keep records. And you're keeping the records because, it'll help you with the insurance. It'll help you with the other recovery efforts. And ultimately, it will help you because you'll be able to answer questions from your licensing agency or the public health entity. This is just for pictures, but it gives you an idea of the importance of record keeping. So, next slide, please. When you're doing the work, you don't want people to get hurt while you're doing the job. So there's a number of physical hazards, structural collapse, struck by materials, working at heights, that kind of thing. And so, it's important. People don't want to necessarily do that, but you need to be wearing long sleeve shirts, long pants, protective eyewear, either cut resistant or waterproof gloves, maybe hard shoes, that kind of thing. You also want to have adequate sanitary facilities. The whole point here is that you don't want workers to get sick. They need to be able to wash their hands immediately when they're done and before they eat and drink to avoid the hand-to-mouth exposure route. And you don't want people to take stuff home. There is a possibility that you might disturb asbestos materials or lead-based paint. So hopefully you've already identified those conditions before you get to work. And a big issue that we see recurring time after time again is carbon monoxide poisoning, and it could either be from a portable generator, it could be from any kind of gas-powered equipment, pressure washers, buffers. So it's really important to be aware of that issue. And also, the powered equipment itself has a hazard, so you want to make sure that only people that know what they're doing operate any kind of powered equipment. So that's a really important part. Next slide, please. So a lot of people want to use respirators, and respirators have a place, but in the workplace, respirators are used only in very specific situations, and under OSHA standards and best practices, employers have to have quite a detailed respirator program. Well, you're not necessarily going to have that in the kind of work you're going to be doing. That's not to say they can't help, but the key points are that they need to be certified by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, or cleared by the Food and Drug Administration. You really need to follow the manufacturer's instructions to get a fit, so you put it on properly, and that you know when to change it, and you store it. Some people, if they are claustrophobic or have respiratory disease or heart disease, shouldn't wear respirators. The whole point here is that you don't want to get a false sense of security. You don't want the respirator to create a hazard. So there's a couple situations where respirators are not recommended. One of them is that they don't provide any protection. These devices don't provide any protection against gases, vapors, or odors. And if there are ever any confined spaces or places where you think there might be a lack of breathable air, like a sump, a pit, maybe a flooded crawl space, they don't provide any potential protection against an oxygen-deficient atmosphere. So don't wear respirators in those situations. Next slide, please. So now you've done all this stuff, and now the question is, everybody's worried about mold. So what are molds? They're part of the kingdom of fungi. They're ubiquitous. They're incredibly diverse organisms. You can see that even they're named by genus and species. So the top that's a hunk of blue cheese, and that's a mold called Penicillium roqueforti, which gives blue cheese its nice tangy flavor. The bottom is actually a mold called Penicillium chrysogenum, which is actually the mold that is used commercially to produce the antibiotic penicillium. So it's important to know that they're an incredibly diverse set of species. There's always a few mold spores in the outdoor air, and there's always a few found indoors. Mold growth is a complex mixture. The molds send out hyphae, which are thread-like structures that go through the substrate, the thing they're growing on. Some of that stuff are irritants and allergens. They release stuff into the environment to degrade organic matter, and they create metabolic waste products. Some of them are beneficial in the case of penicillium, or if they make bread rise. They're used for brewing. So ethanol from your favorite alcoholic beverage, if you like to partake, and carbon dioxide, if you like a frothy beer, those are natural products of the metabolism of molds. Molds also release other substances, and the one that everybody's worried about are what are called mycotoxins. And they are a legitimate concern by the route of ingestion. So corn and other commodities are screened for aflatoxins. Stachybotrys, the toxic black mold, there's documented cases where people have been made sick by eating moldy grain. There's also useful products again, but the bottom part is that mold grows when mold spores land in a place that has a suitable food source, an adequate amount of moisture for a long enough time, and also at the right temperature too. I didn't include that, but that's really important to remember. But they grow anywhere, their growth range for molds is anywhere from 50 degrees to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, anywhere in between. So, next slide, please. So, we're always inhaling a few mold spores, and we actually can inhale lots of mold and not have any ill effects. If you find mold growth, there's going to be other dampness-related contaminants. That's why I try to always talk about dampness and mold growth. Other microbial growth, dust mites, insects. Most molds are not human pathogens, with a couple of exceptions. Sensitive people might be at greater risk, and again, children are more susceptible than adults. This is what the California Department of Public Health says, that visible water damage, damp materials, and visible mold are associated with respiratory symptoms, and the best predictor is the extent and severity of dampness, the visible mold, the moldy odors, and the ways for people to get exposed, the pathways that people might be exposed. In other words, more is bad. We can't necessarily quantify it, but we know that more is bad. Next slide, please. So now we need to do mold remediation. So I think it's really important to remember that the goal here is restoring your building to a clean and dry condition. That's not necessarily mold-free, but it's an environment where molds won't grow. And so you're going to be thinking about this based on the category of the source water, or the quality of the source water, and the class of damage. And the general strategy here is find and fix the moisture sources and get the mold growth out of the environment. And you do that either by getting rid of the material or by cleaning. There's lots of guidance and best practices and standards from government agencies out there and industry trade groups, but every situation, again, you can't game these situations. So you have to have some flexibility and professional judgment and common sense, because these guidelines, again, you may not be able to adapt them to every setting. So next slide, please. So the slide on the left and the bottom, that's my shower. So I got a little mold growing in the corners there. You know, I can get in there with Tilex, scrub it off. There's no health risk. I'm doing it wet. That's a cleaning problem. And if I increase ventilation and keep my shower clean, you know, not a big deal. Now, I wouldn't accept that in another setting, but anyway, it's a different story. The picture on the right, that's water that came down inside a window, and it got trapped by the vinyl wallpaper. That's structural damage and decay. That's got to go. No way to clean it. Drywall's a porous material, so that's got to go. It's got to be removed and disposed. Next slide, please. So again, you know, what do you do? On the top, the couch with the surface mold growth, leather couch, if that was a really valuable couch, maybe you could pay and have it professionally restored. I probably would tend to get rid of it. The couch, the red couch that's on the right-hand picture that was obviously submerged, no choice. It's got to go. You might see mold growing on the back of furniture or bookcases, especially because they have a lot of plywood or particle board. You've got mold like that, you probably need to remove and dispose of it. You got mold that occurred on a plastic window frame from condensation and dirt and dust and grime. That's probably something you can clean and dry. Next slide, please. So on the upper left hand, that's a car seat. Theoretically, you could clean it. Nylon is inorganic and and doesn't really absorb water. Practically, you probably won't get the stains out. It might be best to get rid of it. The plastic furniture and the table. Again, you'll have to make some judgments. Theoretically, you could clean it. The challenge might be, depending on how much it got submerged and what got left behind, getting into all the little cracks and crevices. But it would be cleanable, and you could sanitize it and still use it. The bottom two pictures show what happens when water wicks up wood products. Basically, particle board and plywood turn to mush, and they have structural damage, decay, and they need to be gotten rid of. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scope of things. Things that are going to be, that might be put in someone's mouth, you probably can't clean. A lot of toys, stuffed animals, probably that stuff needs to go. But there might be a number of different things that from a child care that you might be able to clean. Probably want to get rid of things like nap mats. You probably want to get rid of, scratched up plastics. You really need to. It's going to be a professional judgment, common sense, how much time and effort you want to put into it. Next slide, please. So now you're at the point where you need some help, and you might need an air quality consultant. The top question: will the person provide you a service that's going to help you develop an action plan that promotes health and well-being and is realistic and affordable? That's the key question. And again, you want to go through and you want to ask a lot of questions. You want to carefully review proposals. Mold is a very interesting thing. If you functionally, I think a license is something that is when a government entity gives someone the privilege to provide a service, and mold assessment and abatement or remediation is licensed in several states. There's also a certification, and it's a bit blurry. Certifications are when a third party says you're an expert. Well, sometimes with third parties, there may not be that great oversight of the curriculum and content and other training. So you have to really be careful. The states that I know that license these issues, well, the state of Washington, D.C., Louisiana, Florida, Maryland, Texas, I believe California, I think New York State. There's probably a few more, but depending on where you live, there may be some degree of oversight about these professionals. Next slide, please. So now you've assessed the problem and you've got to get a contractor. Well, the key here is that you want to get they need to have a work plan, and it needs to be in writing. And it also needs to verify how they're going to do the work, and that includes the competency of the people. And it also includes, I would recommend, and this comes from the asbestos abatement model, that you're going to do periodic inspections while the work's going on. So that's making sure the work they're following what they said they were going to do, that they have lists and labels for all their chemical products. If they say they're going to operate a negative air machine, well, they need to prove it. If they operate a dehumidifier, they need to prove it. And a lot of these things have, they track time, or they can measure air pressure changes or all that stuff. Same thing with the wastes. Then there's also inspections at critical times, say closing a wall cavity or removing a containment after you put up barriers. Well, here they need to have a visible inspection, and they basically need to sign away and say that they've done what they're supposed to do. There's no mold-contaminated materials left behind, no odors, no dust or debris. So that's the verification. Validation is a different issue, and the question there is, did the project achieve its goal? So this is the point where a lot of people want to do air sampling. And if you can go to the next slide, please. Air sampling and testing for mold is a bit of a challenge. The EPA says if you got visible mold growth or water damage or moldy odors, sampling is not necessary, and that's kind of what the CDC says. The challenge here is that we don't have threshold limit values, and that airborne mold levels vary indoors and outdoors across time and space rapidly. So a single sample might not represent the true conditions. And again, mold's a complicated subject. So, all this stuff on the bottom, what I would say is that if you're going to get a consultant who's going to take any kind of measurement or do any kind of sampling, they need to be able to interpret the results based on the context of the site and situation. The best analogy I can provide to you on this is that I got my blood drawn today. And so I'm going to get the paperwork that lists what they found on the various tests my doctors ran, and then I'll also get it flagged if they're outside the limits. Well, what does that mean? That's a discussion between me and my doctor based on my health status, my previous test results, and the reasons that he ordered the test. And so I would suggest that any consultant who does mold testing, you need to make it clear that you expect them to interpret the result, and it's not acceptable for them to hand you a lab report that has general information and leave you at it to interpret the test. We see that problem over and over again. So I think that at that point, I'm kind of at the end. And so as a conclusion, the more work you can do in the interim recovery efforts makes achieving your long-term recovery goals easier. And I'm all about the healthy home principle. So your objective is you want it to be a good place to live or work or have kids. So you want it to be dry and clean and well ventilated and well maintained and contaminant free and pest free and safe. Those are the 7 principles of healthy housing. It's an all hazards approach. It allows you to think about durability and sustainability and ease of maintenance, and it promotes health and well-being. And I think it's really important to think about that as you're going through this process, even though it's traumatic for everybody involved. So now I will have, there's other web-based resources, and I'll take some questions. I know I might have gone a little bit over time, but I hope it was enlightening, and you can also feel free to contact me at any time. I don't care where you live, even though I live in North Carolina. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, David. So many great things to think about and a very thorough presentation. Appreciate it. We did have a question come in, and it's directed towards you. Do you suggest using a mold removal company for child care centers with water damage? And this individual is saying, I feel like if you don't get it all, it will grow right back.
I think the issue is that you do have to look carefully, but molds, they need a food source and they need an adequate amount of water. So again, the mantra here is clean and dry. So you find a few mold spores on a hard, clean, dry surface. Well, it's not a big deal. It might be a bigger deal if it's in a hidden location or in a location that might get wet subsequently or something like that. But mold won't grow on unless there's a food source and an adequate amount of moisture and contact time and at the right temperature. So really, clean and dry is the most important part. Kind of like they were talking about in the food safety, where that you're going to keep food outside of that critical range. Obviously, food already has moisture and it has nutrient sources, but the whole idea is to not create an environment where the molds can start rapidly amplifying.
Great, thank you. And then we have one question related to food safety, so I'll let Susan or Aubrey answer that. The question is, how does power outage impact food use-by dates? So the dates that are stamped on foods, what would be the impact to that?
So the use-by or sell-by dates marked on food are not food safety related. They're not mandated by the USDA. They're for quality. So so it's a quality issue if those are extended beyond their beyond the date on the whatever it may be, the food item. Does that answer?
Thank you. Yeah. One more question that just came in is, there's a few more coming in. So we will just take a couple of minutes for these and then we'll close up the webinar. I know it's scheduled for an hour. One of the questions that came in, or it's a situation, they said our sump pump quit due to a power outage. 2 inches at least came into the area where the daycare is. Should I remove the laminate floor or water test it first to see if it's holding water? So a question for you, David.
I think it might, well, I think you could probably assume that it is holding water, so I probably would suggest removing the laminate floor, and then you'd also be interested in what's underneath it. If it happened to be wooden or particle board subflooring, then you would definitely have a bigger problem. If it's concrete, you'd probably still want to take up the laminate floor because some pump water is like flood water, and there's going to be dirt and debris and all sorts of stuff that's left behind, and you probably want to be able to clean the concrete floor before you put the laminate floor back.
Thank you for that. If we didn't have a chance to get to your question tonight on the live webinar, we'll certainly follow up with you. I see a couple more sitting here, so we will do some follow-up with you one-on-one after the webinar. Just wanted to send a couple of reminders out or restate a couple of things that we did record this webinar. So within 1 week, it will be posted to childcareprepare.org. I know there was a lot of information shared tonight, so we'll have the slides available for you to download. We'll also have the accompanying handouts that were referenced tonight. If you were a participant in the live webinar, you'll also get a training certificate emailed to you within 2 weeks, and that will come from NAFCC, our partners on this webinar. Also a reminder that you can find information on our upcoming webinars on our website as well. So feel free to check those out. And then know that you can always contact our emergency preparedness team at Child Care Aware of America, either through our webpage, you can request TA, or you can email us at the email address that's listed at the top, preparedness@usa.childcareaware.org. So thanks everybody for your great participation tonight. Thank you to all of our excellent panelists, such expertise that we had on the line tonight. So really appreciate that. And with that, I think we'll wish you all a good evening, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thanks, everybody.